What is up, YouTube? Venthros here, coming at you with a long overdue RPG Maker tutorial. That's right, I am back, and let's get right to it. In the last tutorial that we did, we covered variables. And in this tutorial, we're going to take what we learned about variables and take it to the next level in order to make a very simple, I think it's really easy to do, switch puzzle. So let's get started. Right here on my map here, you'll see that here we have a door here. We have 4 different switches. We got like a glyph or a pentagram here. And this is a signpost or something. This sign is not actually required to do this, but I like to do it when I'm playtesting to make sure that the value that we're trying to store in the variables is working correctly. So I guess the first thing you got to figure out when you're designing a puzzle is what are you trying to do? Are you trying to open a door? Are you trying to make a path, maybe with like a push rock puzzle, which we're not doing in this video. So what we want is we want the player to push a certain number of these buttons in order to open a door, and they have to be the correct buttons. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. So take all this with a grain of salt, but this is how I did it. The first thing we need to do is we need to create a variable, and we're going to do that with this sign here. So go ahead into event editing mode. Well, go ahead and get your map looking like this or something similar to it, but make sure you have 4 things that you're going to use as switches. So I'm going to open up this sign event, and the only thing we want to do is we want this sign to tell us what the current value of the variable is. So we'll call the variable switches. So go to the first page, go to control variables, and we'll just call this one switches. Call it whatever you want. You can call it buttons or whatever. Okay. So delete that. We just wanted to set up the switch. So we want to do a show text command, and we want it to say value is. And I remember from the last video how we type the command to show the value of the variable. So right now the variable is at 0. So if we were to play test this right now and check out this sign, we got to set the priority the same as characters. The value is going to be 0. Now, the reason that we created this variable is we're going to assign a value to each one of these switches. And when the value of this variable is a certain number, that is what's actually going to open the door. Okay? So, with 4 switches, there's a couple different ways to do it, but I'm using the smallest numbers I can. So I want the value of what opens the door to be 8. So we got to figure out a combination of one or more of these switches that can be pressed in order to equal 8. And it doesn't have to be 8, it can be any number that you want. But I'm using the lowest numbers that I can. So I'm going to go over here to region editing mode, and you'll see that I've assigned a number to each switch. This actually doesn't do anything, okay? This is just to help you visualize the value that you want each button to represent. So with these 4 numbers, 1, 4, 2, and 5, there is only one combination of these switches that will equal 8. No matter what you do, there's only one way to get to the number 8, and that's if you add 1, 2, and 5. That equals 8. No other combination can get you to 8. All right? 5 and 2 is 7. 2, 4, and 1 is 7. So those are the three buttons that these are the three buttons that the player is going to have to push in order to open the door. Okay, so that we'll focus on the buttons first. So let's start over here with the left button, the red button, we'll call it. And each button, we're going to have to create 3 event pages. So let's start with the first one. The first one is we want to trigger, we want the action button to be the trigger, which is the default. And when you trigger the event, we want to turn self switch A on, which will take us to the next page. And we want to play a sound. So this is the player actually pushing the button. So we'll go over here to play sound effect. And the one we're looking for is switch 1. Use whichever one you like. I don't know if you can hear that. And that's all we're going to do. Okay. Now we're going to create a new event page. And this only applies, that only applies when self switch A is on. So this is going to be the button actually pushed. So the first thing we have to do is go to the graphics, go down here to switch 2, and pick this one, or you can pick the bottom one, it doesn't matter. Just something that visually shows the player that the button's been pressed. Okay, so we'll do that. And this one is actually going to be a parallel process, and we haven't really done any events in any of the tutorial videos that uses a parallel process, but think of a parallel process as a sort of, it's kind of like an auto run event, except that you can do other stuff while it's running. Okay? It's very important to make sure this is a parallel process, because if you make this an auto run event, you won't be able to move or do anything. It'll freeze up your game. Okay, so just remember for these buttons, page 2, you want it to be a parallel process. Okay, now this is the page, this is the part of the button event that actually tells the game what the variable value is, and also it communicates with the door event so that when the door is, when the value is 8, it opens the door. All right, so we've determined that self switch A has to be on, and then we're going to do 2 conditional branches. So go over here, conditional branch, uncheck the set handling when conditions do not apply. Now the first one we want is we want if the variable switches equals 0, that's the condition we want to check. Okay, so I should kind of backtrack for a minute. This pentagram here serves as a way to reset the puzzle. If you push all 4 buttons, obviously the door is not going to open. So if the player wants to reset the puzzle and try it again, we want them to be able to stand on this pentagram, glyph, or whatever you want to call it, to pop all the buttons back out and reset the puzzle. Okay, so just keep that in mind. I should have said that first before we started messing with the buttons, so I apologize for that. So we're on page 2, and we're checking to see if the reset button has been pushed. We want the self switch to turn off. Control self switch A off, so that'll put it back to here. So if something happens that would make this, if the player steps on the glyph that resets the puzzle, it'll actually revert back to this. Easy enough. Okay, and then we want to play the same switch sound just for effect. Okay, so that's it for that. Now, I'm going to show you. We're actually going to create another switch. Okay. So let's create a second conditional branch. And this time, we want to check if the new switch is on. And the new switch that we're going to create is called reset. And if the reset switch is on, we want to do the following things. We want to make sure that the self switch is off. And we also want to make sure that it turns the reset switch off. And then play the sound. Now, the reason why we're doing two things that basically accomplish the same thing is that if you don't do it this way, you won't be able to reset all the switches at once. And that's a problem that you might run into. So make sure that your event page looks like this. All right. Now we want to create a third page. And we're going to create another switch. And this switch is going to be called door opened. So we want to render the button inoperable once the door is open. We don't want to be able to keep pushing the switches or anything like that. So just change the graphic to the same one you used on page 2. And make sure that the trigger is the action button. So this actually kills the parallel process as well as prevents the button from being used. See, because you don't want to have too many parallel processes going on at once, because they never go away unless you end them or create another blank page. No matter where you are in the game, that process is still running. Even if you're 20 hours ahead of that point in the game, it's going to keep running and lag your game. So that's the other reason why we moved to this page once the door is open. We don't want to use the switch anymore, and we don't want that parallel process running either. It's the same principle of making sure that you end your auto run events in the same manner by creating a blank page so that your character doesn't freeze. So I'm satisfied with that. So our button is complete. Now, one thing that I actually forgot to do, probably the most important thing, is when the button is actually pushed, what we want to do is add the value to the variable. And remember, the far left button, the value is 1. So what we're going to do is we are going to control variables. And we don't want to use set here, okay? We want to add, because the switch variable is going to be a cumulative total between all 4 buttons. If you leave it on set and you set it to 1, when you click another one of the buttons, if you don't put it on add, it'll set the value to 4 is the next button, instead of adding 4 to it. So in this case, all 4 buttons we want to add the constant. Okay, so the red button is worth 1. So just to give you an idea, and it's always good to play test all this stuff. All right. So I'm going to go over here and go over here to the sign. Right now the value is 0. And what we want to do is push the button and just verify that the value is 1. And that's all we're checking. So the button right now is working as intended. So really, all you need to do at this point is just do some copying and pasting to for the rest of these buttons, which I'll do that now. You know, so copy, and this is just the first page. So just do that with the other 3 buttons. Okay. Now, we're not changing anything with the first page, so everything is fine as is. So now go to the second page. All right, and everything this is all going to be the same for each button. So the commands are going to be the same, and with the other buttons, you want to make sure that they are parallel processes and you change the graphic. All right. So here we're going to make a new event page. We're going to change the graphic for the green button. We're going to make this a parallel process, and then go over here and paste the commands, because we're only dealing with self switches and kind of like universal switches specific to this event anyway. So that's good. So just do the same thing with the other two. I'm just going to kind of breeze through this as fast as I can here. Parallel process. Done. And once you get the hang of this, this stuff you'll be able to do very, very, very quickly. Like I am. Okay, parallel process. Very important, like I said, that the second pages for all these are parallel processes. Okay, now that we've done that, we want to... see, I forgot something already. So remember, our second page for the red button, we have to check the self switch A is on, and I didn't do that here. So go to page 2, self switch A is on, page 2, so forth and so on. All right, now those are ready. Now page 2 only really deals with what happens when the player steps on this, okay? And then page 3 deals with what happens when the door is open. Now, since we know that 1, 2, and 5 equal 8, when we change, well, I'll just show you. And I know I say a lot. I'm actually working on it. I'm going to go ahead and open this page 3, and remember that we're keeping this graphic. Now, for the green button, since the player didn't push it in order to open the door, we are going to make sure that page 3 uses the original switch button graphic, the one with the button pushed out, because once the door is open, we're not going to have that switch push itself or anything like that. And this condition is that the door open switch is on, and leave everything else alone. That's all you have to do. Okay? So, click here, new event page, door opened is on, change your graphic. Now this is the yellow button. So we want to use the pushed in yellow button graphic. Leave everything else alone. And then we'll do the same thing here with the blue button. Door open is on. Change the graphic. So these 3 buttons will stay pushed in. This one will stay not pushed on page 3, remember. Okay, so that's all we have to do with the buttons. The buttons are finished. The next thing that I want to do is take care of this door event. Now, I'm not doing a complete door event. I'm not doing the right-click, quick event creation door, okay? Because you want to create your door event from scratch here, and it's not actually all that hard. So what we want is we want the door to open when the switches variable equals 8. So we're going to do a conditional branch. When variable switches is equal to 8. And now we're going to actually do the animation of the door opening. This is optional, okay? But if you want your game to have a little bit of professional look to it, you're going to want to animate your door. When you use the quick create command to create a door, it takes care of all this stuff for you. But it's good to know how to do it yourself. So go to page 2, and we're going to set the move route for this event, okay? And it's really easy. First, you want to turn left, and then use the wait command for 3 frames. You want to turn right, use another wait command for 3 frames, and turn up. That's it. That is it right there. And then we're going to play a sound. And I wrote down that we're going to use the close 3. Because it's kind of like a stone door. So we'll do something like that. I just moved the pitch down. So there we go. Then we're going to turn self switch A on. And then we're going to turn the door opened switch on. Okay, so that's really it for the door. For the first page. Okay, now the one thing that I forgot to mention is that we want this to be a parallel process as well, because we want to be able to manipulate the buttons and do other stuff while we're waiting for this door to open. Okay, so the door is always going to be checking for this variable to equal 8 during a parallel process. If you leave it on action button, it will only check if this equals 8 when the player walks up to the door and pushes the action button. That's what we don't want. If you use an auto run to check, it'll automatically be checking, but you won't be able to do anything. Okay, so that's why the parallel process is key here. So the next page, we're going to kill the auto run process. We're going to not use a graphic because the door is going to be open, and we're just going to leave everything else blank. So now the door is finished. So we finished the buttons, we finished the door, and we finished the sign. The only thing that's really left to do is to figure out this, okay? And I'll be honest with you, figuring out the glyph was pretty challenging when I first did these. But if you follow along with exactly what I'm going to show you, it will be easy to understand, hopefully. So let's open up the glyph. Right now, the glyph is fine as is. All right. Now, the graphic I use for the glyph is this one here. And as you can see, it has 2 pictures next to it. And this is an animated one. So it'll show like a little swirling around the glyph, which is what I wanted. So pick any color you want, but I'm going to use the blue. And make sure that you uncheck walking animation and check stepping animation. And that will make sure that the animation plays for this glyph. Okay, so just wanted to throw that out there. And the next thing we want to do is make sure that the priority is below characters and we're on player touch. Okay, because the trigger for this glyph is when the player steps on it. But right now, we don't want the glyph to do anything because the player hasn't pushed any buttons yet. All right, so we're going to create a new page. And the condition for this new page to apply is if the variable switches is 1 or greater. Okay, now the switches variable is what opens the door. So the only way it can be 1 or greater is when a player pushes any of the buttons. So this makes sure that the glyph only works after the player has touched any of the buttons. We don't want the glyph to function or do anything until the player, like, you know, they push a couple buttons, they realize the door doesn't open, they want to try again. Okay, so we want to keep the same graphic. And keep the stepping animation. We want the trigger to be the player touch. And we want the priority to be below characters. So now that we are in a position to reset everything, page 2 is going to be what happens when the player actually steps on it. So we want to control switches. We want to turn on the reset switch. and we want to take the control variable, we want to take the switches variable and make it 0. This effectively resets the value of the switches variable to 0. And that's exactly what we want. We want to use set. So I know earlier with the buttons we were adding to the variable. But with this reset button, we want to set it to 0 every time. We always want it to be 0 every time we use the reset button. So leave it on set. The way it is just fine. And then we're going to insert a wait command, which is on page 2 up here, wait. And we're going to call it 10 frames. So the player is going to actually pause for a brief moment when they step on the glyph. So what we want now is once the door is opened, I want this to go away. So I'm sure you know how we're going to do that by now. So we want to create a new page. We want the condition of this page that the door open switch is on. And that's it. Leave the rest of it blank. And we are done. Hopefully I did everything right and everything works. Let's check it out. Now remember, this sign, all it does is tell you what the value is. So this is a good way to make sure that the buttons are putting in the correct values. Actually, I already know that I didn't do that right because I never did it. Okay, so, good thing I checked. Alright, so with the green, yellow, and blue buttons, we have to go in real quick. Go here, right-click, and hit Edit. Alright, so the green button is worth 4. Because remember, this is 1, 4, 2, 5. Right? And do the same thing here. You can use the space button to edit, as a space bar to edit as well. And that one's worth 2. And the last one is worth 5. Alright, now we should be in business. Glad I checked that. But if I didn't check it, you would know how the variable was behaving because of this. So we know that the red button is worth 1. So we're going to push that and then check the sign. And it should say the value is 1. Now we're going to reset. Now the button is popped out. And if we check the value again, the value is 0. So we know the reset button works, but let's double check it and make sure it really works. So let's check the value here. It's 6. And then we're going to step on this. Both buttons pop back out. And the value is 0. So let's see if the door opens. Boom. The door opened and the hexagram went away, the glyph or whatever you want to call it. And that's the end of the puzzle. So take what you've learned about variables in the last video and in this video. I know this one is a little more trickier maybe than what you're used to, but just remember that the variable is what is controlling when the door opens. The buttons are essentially fixed numbers that you're adding to the variable, and this glyph only serves to reset the value of the variable to 0 and pull the buttons out so the player can continue with the puzzle. So that's our tutorial for today. I want to take a moment and thank everyone for all their support. I have not ignored any of you, even though I have been away from Facebook. I've dealt with some equipment malfunctions and other things and school and all this stuff. I have been watching the channel carefully, and I really appreciate all the support. There are people that are swooping in and answering questions that I should be answering for me. I want to reach out to all of you and thank you. Just keep the support coming. It really means a lot. And stay tuned for the next video coming soon. Thanks a lot.